In the early 19th century, archaeologists began to find the remnants of ancient Sumer. This lost civilization contained many ancient documents and is probably the birthplace of writing. Among the treasures found in the region, one was the longest Sumerian epic ever uncovered, called a Nemerkar in the Lord of Aratta. The text, originally published in 1851, perplexed scholars for what it recorded. According to most translations, the ancient authors recorded there was once a time in their distant past when all the people worshipped Enlil with one tongue, until one day the god Enki came down and confused the languages. It was more than just the biblical comparisons that amazed scholars, because this text also said something strange. According to the ancient polytheistic culture, there was once a time in their past when all the people addressed or worshipped one god. This was not clear enough to definitively be a report of ancient monotheism, but it did seem odd, because monolatristic tendencies were thought to have developed much later, yet this ancient polytheistic culture taught as if these tendencies existed in their distant past. Fast forward a few decades, at the turn of the 19th century, and various scholars are debating the origin of religion, with many theories offered to explain how mankind became religious. However, the theory that rose to fame was E.B. Tylor's evolutionary hypothesis. According to Tylor, religions evolved slowly from simplistic animism, then to complicated forms of polytheism, then to henotheism, and finally, monotheism was the last to develop. Thus, monotheism was thought to be a late development, and could not be older than 3 millennia. However, one of Tylor's biggest advocates soon turned this idea on its head. A scholar named Andrew Lang first was a defender of Tylor's evolutionary theory, but the reports coming from explorers and anthropologists studying the most primitive cultures didn't align with Tylor's model. Thus Lang, to the shock of many, abandoned Tylor's view and proposed his own theory on the origins of religion that began with monotheism. Andrew Lang drew heavily on published reports coming out of Australia and the Aboriginal tribes that inhabited the continent. Australia was an interesting area to study because the continent, for the most part, was virtually isolated for thousands of years, with very little contact with the West. Recent studies have confirmed oral traditions and beliefs have possibly persisted for 7,000 years. Due to a high level of isolation and very little technological growth or change. Then another study suggested an oral tradition in the southeastern region could be almost 40,000 years old, suggesting Aboriginal beliefs and traditions are far older than most written records found in more advanced early civilizations. Many of the native tribes were still living very simple hunter-gatherer ways of life and relying on stone tools. Thus, Australia was seen as a continent that contained resemblances, frozen in time, of what humans believed at our early stages of development. Let's be clear, Lang and his followers did not argue Australia was a monotheistic continent. They recognized there was a wide amount of diversity of religious ideas among the various tribes. Yet many of the more isolated and primitive tribes didn't fit with Tylor's model, and seemed to have monotheistic tendencies about a high god called the Allfather. In other words, Lang and his followers argue that generally speaking, the more primitive tribes who relied on minimal sustenance and had the least amount of innovations were more monotheistic, whereas tribes that had developed and integrated more were more polytheistic. I'll pronounce these names as best as I can, but I apologize if my pronunciation is off. According to the early reports, within the southeastern region, the Ngari Ngari believed in a supreme father who created everything and taught humans all their rituals. Then he and his children moved up to the sky. The Maranu people say the supreme being created the land, gave laws, and then ascended to heaven. Many tribes that belong to the Kulin language group believe in a supreme being called Bunjil, who they refer to as our father. early anthropologist Alfred Howitt, one of Lang's sources, reports that the tribes believe Bunjil lives in the sky and prescribes moral laws, like avoiding adultery and not taking advantage of women that are alone. The Ganai believe in a supreme being, referred to as Father. He had a son named Tundan, who was considered to be their ancestor. The supreme being also allegedly caused the oceans to overflow because of specific ethical violations, which killed many people. Some tribes worship a high god called Duramulin, whereas in other tribes, this figure is the son of the supreme being called Bayami. Allegedly, the Yuan tribes that worship him lack evidence of animism or ancestor worship, which seems to be the case with a lot of the primitive tribes in the southeastern region. The tribes that worship Bayami refer to him as the All-Father, and he gives ethical and ritual laws the tribes must obey. He is the creator and sustainer of all things, has appeared in human form, and bestowed gifts to the people. Images of Bayami are forbidden, except in rituals or in hidden caves. If an image is needed for a ritual, it is destroyed immediately after. Although Bayami is accompanied by other lesser beings, including mother figures, worship among the men is primarily directed at Bayami, not other beings. Male initiates were given ethical rules to follow, such as avoiding murder, lying, stealing a wife, and to be kind to the weak and elderly. Howitt suggests all these deities represent the same being under different names. Then, on top of that, Alfred Radcliffe Brown couldn't help but remark Bayami thus closely resembles one aspect of the god of the Hebrews. On the northern end of the continent, anthropologist Lloyd Warner studied tribal beliefs in the northeastern corner, where he found tribal worship of a being called Yurlungur, who was called Rainbow Serpent or Great Father, and allegedly caused a flood sometime in the distant past. Further west in the Arnhem Land were also monotheistic tendencies about the Rainbow Serpent, but here referred to as the All-Mother, who was very similar to the All-Father in the south. However, Lester Hyatt notes this idea was more about functional aspects or the deity's role, as the All-Mother had the generative properties of both sexes. Further west, the Unambel people worship the Rainbow Serpent as Ungud, who made the world and appears to be beyond gender itself. Hyatt says, Ungud is thus above all an archetype of life itself, an all-soul perhaps, rather than a father god or mother god. In another region of Australia, a pair of skeptical anthropologists named Spencer and Gillian studied a group within the Aranda people. Initially, the two found very little evidence of what was considered developed religious ideas. Spencer even wrote to James Fraser, expressing delight, thinking they confirmed Fraser's theory that religion was a late development out of beliefs concerning magic. However, in 1927, Spencer revised his book after more research of this specific tribe's beliefs. To quote anthropologist Lester Hyatt, Spencer added a section devoted to a being known as Numbakula. The Aranda regarded Numbakula as the supreme ancestor, overshadowing all others. He created the mountains and rivers, the plants and animals, the increased ceremonies, and the sacred icons used in them. Afterwards, he rose into the sky and disappeared forever. Geza Roim documented that a Western group of Aranda believed the first couple were made by a heavenly creator by throwing down 2 stones from the sky. Now, many Aranda tribes were not monotheistic, as they incorporated ideas of totemism and nature worship. But Hyatt notes that many of the tribes in the southeast with more monotheistic tendencies were less culturally developed, and yet their religious ideas, especially belief in a high god, seemed more advanced than those of the Aranda. In other words, the less developed tribes were more monotheistic, even though that is perceived as more advanced religiously. Moreover, they displayed little to no evidence of evolving from a prior polytheistic pantheon that the high god could have taken over, or ancestor worship, where a chief could have been appointed to the position. Spencer tried to argue religion itself evolved from ancestral worship, but this was not proven to be the case even among the tribes he studied. Lehman and Myers said, A major problem with Spencer's argument that ancestor worship was the first religion is that many societies at the hunting and gathering level do not practice ancestor worship. The Aranta of Australia, for example, worship their totemic plants and animals, but not their human ancestors. Elsewhere, Catherine Stowe lived among an indigenous tribe. She originally held that animism and polytheism preceded monotheism. However, even she wrote, "I was well acquainted with and believed in Mr. Herbert Spencer's ghost theory of the origin of religion in the worship of ancestral spirits. What I learned from the natives surprised me and shook my faith in Mr. Spencer's theory, with which it seemed incompatible." In concluding her chapter in The Belief on the Allfather, she wrote, "In these circumstances, authenticated by Mr. Howard himself, it is impossible to accept the theory that belief in an Allfather is only reached in the course of such advance to a higher social organization." There are many other examples I could have listed, but even in most tribes that were more polytheistic, there virtually always was a high god creator concept. Thus, as the 13th edition of A History of the World's Religions says, the adult males of most tribes in southeastern Australia attributed all their customs and rituals ultimately to a high god or old man of the sky who was eternal and uncreated, having existed from the beginning of all things, and was supreme and without equal. He was called among the tribes various secret names known only to the initiated males, such as Narendra, Byamban, Bunjil, Mungangame, Narelli, and the like. Often, he was referred to as our father. Some tribesmen felt that he was not much concerned about their doings. Others, such as the Kurnai, thought he watched over them constantly. When all the evidence is considered, that practically all of the Australian tribes held a belief in some kind of high god. Lang drew heavily on this data, as well as evidence from tribes from other geographical regions. However, his work was virtually ignored or dismissed by the scholarly community at large. Lester Hyatt even remarked, "The study of Aboriginal high gods virtually disappeared for about 60 years. But still, Tyler and some of Lang's contemporaries did respond to him. In the early 90s, anthropologist Eric Kulig restated a lot of the early objections offered against Lang's theory. The main objections were that the Aboriginal beliefs in a high creator god were either the result of misunderstandings by missionaries, or that Aboriginal tribes adapted their religious beliefs to incorporate a high creator figure to synchronize with the beliefs of Christian missionaries. Some early critics took this route because of racist ideas that the Aboriginals could not have developed what was perceived as advanced religious knowledge. However, these main objections were met by early authors such as Lang himself, and later writers such as anthropologist Lester Hyatt and philosopher of religion Winfried Cordon. First, no one denies missionaries look for Christian similarities within native tribes, and at times misunderstood things, as is the case with Carl Strelu in thinking Ultra was a term for a high god. But the reports of high gods among the Aboriginals came from various anthropologists as well, not just missionaries. Also, it is not the case missionaries assume the existence of a high god in every Aboriginal tribe, as there were reports of polytheistic activity as well. In certain tribes, the high god was said to have a wife or multiple wives, which would be heretical for Christians. It would be cherry-picking to only select the tribes with monotheistic tendencies and claim this was a misunderstanding from missionaries, but ignore the fact this didn't happen in every instance. Second, there were instances when Aboriginal tribes incorporated tales they heard from European settlers, such as legends about comets hitting the Earth. But the indications are they were understood as a white man's story, so the native people seem to be able to routinely distinguish between their own tales and later European stories. Third, the reports of the high gods were sometimes accompanied with legends of the creator's actions, which often made him look foolish or impotent in certain ways. This is unlikely to have come from missionaries, as missionaries would have taught God was omnipotent and omniscient. Fourth, the evidence suggests Aboriginal men were quite secretive and conservative, not even sharing their beliefs with outsiders or their own women and children. Many of the people who studied their customs spent years gaining their trust before they could learn anything. It is unlikely that upon initial contact, the tribesmen would make central a belief they heard from white foreigners, only to keep it secret and not share it with those exact same outsiders for years. Fifth, sometimes cultural similarities do arise by coincidence, and proponents on both sides tend to seize on the similarities as more than they are. For example, Geza Roim notes within the Noi Noi there was a belief about where death came from. The legend says the first man and woman were forbidden to go near a sacred tree that a divine being that manifested as a bat lived in. One day, the woman approached the tree while collecting wood for fire. The bat flew away and death came into the world after that. This is obviously similar to the account of Adam and Eve in Genesis 3. But Roim notes it probably developed independently as a result of sex symbolism, as it fits more with their own cultural ideas. Thus, it is too hasty for critics to jump on similarities of this story and assume it had to come from missionaries, just like it would be hasty for Christians to assume this legend corroborates the biblical account. Hyatt summarizes Lang's rebuttal. First, Aboriginal high gods have been recorded in circumstances strongly suggesting that the beliefs were in existence prior to contact with Europeans. The missionaries at Wellington were told about Bayami and the songs in which he was worshipped shortly after they arrived. Further north, in 1844-5, in a frontier region, well beyond direct Christian influence, a settler named John Manning, inspired by a conversation with Gödel, studied native customs and made extensive notes on Bayami's similarities to the Christian god. In order to maintain that Aboriginal notions of deity are the product of proselytization, one would have to assume that Christian beliefs caught on at their points of introduction, and like smallpox, traveled ahead of the invaders. Second, detailed information about Aboriginal high gods has consistently come from initiated adult males on the understanding that it should not be divulged to women and children. If it were true that the deities of the male cults were borrowed from the missionaries, how would we reconcile the men's desire for secrecy with the fact that knowledge of Christian doctrine is freely available to all? Furthermore, male elders in Aboriginal society are notoriously conservative. Why, especially in the matter of religion, should they be so ready to abandon old beliefs and embrace the new? One of Lang's fiercest proponents was Wilhelm Schmidt, who throughout his lifetime published a 12-volume work on original monotheism. Lang drew from other cultures, but Schmidt built on this and documented several other primitive tribes with monotheistic tendencies. Another area where primitive monotheism was found was among Native Americans. Again, it is clear not all Native American tribes are monotheistic. However, tribes that displayed signs of being very primitive were surprisingly monotheistic. For example, one of the most primitive and simplistic tribes ever discovered was that of the Yuki, who were geographically isolated from several other tribal groups. Edward Gifford said, "I went to the coast Yuki, expecting to find a very primitive phase of Central Californian culture because of their peripheral and mountainous region they inhabit. In this, I was not disappointed, for they lack the religious, social, and material refinements of many of the Central Californians." However, Yuki tribes were also monotheistic in their thinking. According to anthropologist Jay Miller, the Yuki believe the Creator made everything and lives in the sky and is equated with an all-pervading thought or consciousness. Edward Curtis also noted they believed all souls return to the Creator when they die, and in their creation account, the Creator was over the water before there was light, and then by a spoken word, the earth was created, and then he populated it with people. The account then also goes on to record a great flood in the distant past. Another primitive group is the Maidu, who have a very similar but more complex or developed creation myth, where the Earthmaker is hovering over the waters and singing the world into existence. His name was Wanomai, which according to the Oxford Dictionary of World Mythology means without death. One creation myth even begins with, "In the beginning there was no sun, no moon, no stars. All was dark." The Algonquian were one of the most populous people in North America, and within their cultures, many tribes had strong monotheistic tendencies, and focused their worship to the Great Spirit, who is the creator of all things and giver of life. Schmidt records in his analysis of high gods in North America that the Lenape and Western Arapahoes directed worship only to the Great Spirit, unlike the Lakota, who directed their dances and worship at the sun. The Lenape and Arapahoes also allegedly gave up offerings of first fruit to the Great Spirit. Archaeologist Edward J. Lennox says, "Among Indian peoples in the Canadian Shield, the Great Spirit, also called Kitche-Manito, was the highest and most powerful and sacred of all the Manitos. The Great Spirit created and controlled the universe. Nanaboju, spelled variously, was a messenger of the Great Spirit, who made the earth, stocked it with animals, and brought medicine, a concept of curing, to the people." He also notes of the Lenape that they believed in named spiritual entities, including a Great Spirit called Kishalam-Yukon, who created the world, human beings, and all things in nature. Kishalam-Yukon lived at the top of a 12-tiered structured universe, in which all things had a place or rank. Earth was at the bottom of this scale. He also created the sun and thunder beings, who protected the world from the enemy, known as the Horned Serpent. On top of this, anthropologist J. Miller listed several other primitive tribes that worship the high god. The Delaware worship the Creator, who made us all by thoughts, eternally sits in the 12th or highest heaven, communicates through thoughts, and good thoughts and prayers are offered up to him. Around James Bay, tribes worship the high god, who is the source of supernatural power and the master of death, life, and food. Among the Creek, the Creator is called Breathholder, and breath is equated with life. The Pawnee, although worshipping other gods, did believe in a supreme Creator, who made humans in his image and created via his thoughts. Another interesting case is of the Salish or Stolo people, who believe in a supreme spiritual force, who created the universe and sustains and created life. They refer to this being as Most High, Lord above and Father, and say he is all-seeing, omnipotent, all-wise, good and never dies. Keith Carlson notes many of the experts dismiss this belief as something adopted when Jesuit missionaries interacted with the tribes. This argument is thrown around for many of the other tribes I mentioned as well. But the Stolo say this is just not the case, and it is kind of presumptuous for outsiders to tell the native tribes where their beliefs came from, as if they know it must be European in origin. Carlson suggests there may have been some slight modification and changes in terminology, but it doesn't make sense to say entire religious ideas changed when Europeans arrived. Coast Salish people take seriously, not only is it regarded as improper to change or modify sacred stories, such as those pertaining to ancient transformations and collective tribal origins, it is dangerous. Protocols pertaining to the integrity of historical narratives suggest that the concept of the Great First is unlikely to have been borrowed or introduced without provoking a major debate within the indigenous community, and such a debate would likely have been remembered by future generations. The Stolo also had sacred taboos about changing their ancient oral traditions, especially with regards to the Creator, as they believed it could shorten their lives or cause birth defects. So the culture had built-in mechanisms to retain ancient oral traditions. Again, Carlson says, one respected authority on the cultural protocols explained, "Some of our own people have the idea that our transformer and origin stories are like fairy tales, things you can make up or change. They aren't. This seems to be especially the case with those of our people who have gone off to university and gotten degrees." It's far more likely the Stolo people simply saw no contradictions between their own beliefs and that of what Christian missionaries taught. A similar idea can be seen among the Mi'kmaq. ethnologist Angela Robinson provided a comprehensive study of the relation between the indigenous religious beliefs and Christianity, and notes many Mi'kmaq people say both belief systems are perfectly compatible. Dr. Terry LeBlanc, a Mi'kmaq representative, explains using an interesting connection.
When asked by some young ones about the meaning of the words in their language for the Creator, Magat Miskam, an elder said, "Well, it's like the word in the Bible, which the Hebrew people had for their God, Yahweh. No one really knows entirely what it means. The Creator of all things is so much a mystery that the name does not describe who the Creator is, but only helps us to speak about the Creator."
I could list several other examples of high gods among the Native American tribes. Even in more polytheistic tribes, there was evidence of a high creator god. As like with the Aboriginal tribes, and with many other examples around the world, the argument from Tyler's school was such people were too primitive to have monotheistic tendencies, so it must have come from European incorporation. But a lot of the same issues come up, as did with the Aboriginal tribes of Australia. As Winfried Cordon says, the notion that the belief in a single supreme being spread lightning fast ahead of the missionaries can only be characterized as Tyler's bad story made worse. If these supreme beings were inconsistent with the rest of these cultures, if in some tribes they never received any worship, and if they were not associated with any benefits from believing in them, it makes no sense that all of these tribes pick them up instantaneously. It is utterly implausible, which may just be the reason there is no evidence for it. Schmidt didn't stop there, but highlighted other tribes found in remote regions. In the Andaman chain of islands, various isolated tribes existed, and some still are isolated, like the inhabitants of North Sentinel Island. Thus, as Andrew Lang said, their religion is probably not due to missionaries, as they always shot all foreigners and have no traditions of the presence of aliens on their islands before our recent arrival. However, Edward H. Mann did manage to gain their trust and live with them for 11 years. He said their supreme god is invisible, without beginning and end, created everything except evil, knows our thoughts, enforces a moral code, and caused a flood because of moral issues. The tribes also lacked evidence of ancestral worship or early missionary influence. More recently, the Alsnaga people of northeastern India were thought to be originally polytheistic or animistic. But more recently, some researchers have called this into question, and it might have been the case that before conversion to Christianity, that they actually worshipped one supreme being, known by many names, that controls nature, judges the dead, and calls for all to live an upright moral life. When it comes to Africa, many Westerners tend to assume the tribes there are either animistic or polytheistic, with a heavy amount of ancestral worship. Now, this was probably the case for some tribes like the Zulu, but within the past few decades, many African scholars and philosophers have argued a lot of what is known about African spiritual beliefs is based on Western misunderstandings. Many primitive and isolated tribes were quite monotheistic, and some have suggested the first religion in Africa was monotheistic. The Maasai are a known monotheistic tribe. The Maasai religion has no name, but it is monotheistic and personal. The contact between the Maasai and their god is in group and individual prayer, whereby they supplicate and adore him. However, they do not regularly assemble in congregations. Magic medical rituals are considered as separate from worship. Generally, people pray during drought, epidemics, personal or family problems, and rituals. The prayers are centered on children, livestock, and the unity of the community. The Kikuyu were studied by anthropologists William and Catherine Routledge, and focused on the people who demonstrated little influence or knowledge of missionaries. They worshipped a high god, addressed as Father, who loves all but punishes disobedience. The Kikuyu would offer up animal sacrifices to the supreme god under a tree. Nature, in a sense, was worshipped as a manifestation of the power of the supreme god. However, they say they only turn to him in times of crisis, and for more daily matters, they turn to lesser spirits for help. The Himba people worship a high god, Makuru, who is the most powerful and good being in heaven and loves all people on earth. The Himba venerate ancestors who act as intermediaries for Makuru, but they do not seem to be deified. Likewise, the Shona people do perform ancestor veneration, but are quite monotheistic in their approach, believing in an all-powerful creator who governs morality and communicates through the ancestors as intercessors. They also have a practice called chizi, that is like the Sabbath, where they set aside a special day every so often and do not work. The Fang people worship one god with 3 different aspects, who created the first ancestors from clay. They also believe all have a soul that continues on after death. Anthropologist Tobias Haller notes the religions of the Batwa and Illa people are similar to each other and are monotheistic, believing in one creator who divided the lands up among various people groups. One of their hymns about the creator reads as, "In the beginning was God, today is God, tomorrow will be God. Who can make an image of God? He has no body, he is as a word which comes out of your mouth. That word, it is no more, it is past, and still it lives. So is God." Now there are dozens of other African tribal religions I could have covered. Many African scholars and philosophers have lately been trying to correct many Eurocentric misunderstandings about African religions. There is actually a great amount of monotheism and henotheism on the continent, and far less animism, polytheism, or ancestor worship than what was previously thought. So as Dr. Mazurwa says, here is the origin of monotheism, since the oldest remains of humanity have been discovered on the continent. Monotheism is literally spread across the entire continent, even though there was no single empire or media to connect these points. When many Europeans came in contact with these African tribes, they misunderstood a lot of their concepts and assumed polytheism or animism was present. But Dr. Mazurwa notes the confusion was on the Europeans' part, as they didn't suspect Africans could have had what was deemed as advanced religious knowledge, and they often mistook ancestor veneration for ancestor worship. William Abraham states that the rituals associated with ancestors are not rites of worship, but methods of communication. A similar study looked at beliefs about ancestors in 24 different cultures from around the world and found there was no evidence of ancestor worship in these specific primitive cultures, although beliefs about the continual existence of their dead relatives was present in all. So just because there are ancestor rites, that doesn't mean there is ancestor worship. The evidence suggests primitive cultures typically lack worship of the ancestors. Dr. Mazurwa and others have argued most of ancient African religion was quite monotheistic in its approach, and as we've gone over, this seems to be the case in other regions as well, with remote and primitive tribes. Thus, as the history of the world's religion says, it is common to find among many primal peoples a recognition of the existence of a deity, far up in the sky or at great remove, who has made everything, man, woman, earth, sea, and sky, and who at a distance sees all that goes on among them, and sometimes disapproves, but does not often interfere. Among groups like the Pygmies of Africa, the Fuegians of South America, and the Australian bush peoples, the belief in such a high deity has been even clearer and more definite. To understand the amount of monotheism found all over the world, Wilhelm Schmidt published a 12-volume work that is over 11,000 pages that covers in detail monotheism found all over the world, from the remote regions in Russia to the Philippines, Malaysia, the Inuit of Canada, down to the remote regions of Argentina and down to the Fuegian Islands. See, I've barely scratched the surface here. Mircea Eliade said of Schmidt that he was certainly one of the greatest linguists and ethnologists of this century, and he documented evidence of primitive monotheism all over the world. However, Eliade also notes his work was mostly ignored, which he speculates was because of prejudice due to Schmidt being a Catholic priest. But regardless of that, the evidence is still there, which is why I found it easy to rely on some anthropologists that came after Schmidt, who also acknowledged the existence of a supreme god in many of these indigenous religions. Some have objected to this argument because it's still a misunderstanding of the tribal religions, that although they have a high creator god, reports have been embellished and altered to make the creator figure more like he is in Western religions, and the worship of other beings is reduced to mere veneration. However, if this is the case, the same could be said in reverse, that skeptics are assuming a polytheistic outlook and adjusting the religious beliefs of the indigenous people to fit that. At the end of the day, we have to go on what scholars and anthropologists reported, based on their research, and when able, what the indigenous people say themselves, instead of imposing on them what we want. We also have to remember, as we went over in a previous video, the distinction between monotheism and polytheism is blurrier than we realize. Both tend to posit a high creator god and lesser spiritual beings. Many divine beings, for example, are honored in the Avesta, which is the holy book of Zoroastrianism, a monotheistic religion. Winfried Cordan notes Catholics will call upon Mary and saints, but they do not worship them. The inclusion of honor or veneration paid to other spiritual beings, like ancestors, doesn't mean one is not a monotheist. However, the change from monotheism to polytheism would only take a little adjusting by pushing the high god further away while focusing more on lesser beings. This is actually in line with the model Andrew Lang and Wilhelm Schmidt proposed, that cultures, in their most primitive form, are monotheistic, but as they advance and integrate more, attention is paid to lesser divine beings, while the high god, who governs morality, is less focused on, and becomes less approachable. By the time cultures begin to construct large temples and cities, the high god is either reduced to a more human or natural level, like being the sun or another natural object, or his tasks are distributed to lesser deities, and he is pushed further into the background. Of course, the question arises, if this model is true, why would primitive monotheistic cultures evolve into polytheistic cultures by the time they start building cities? Well, let's remember one of the basic features of monotheism found in many of these cultures, which is that there is a supreme god who has no needs and governs moral laws. With that, Andrew Lang sums up how the evolution would occur quite nicely. A moral creator, in no need of gifts and opposed to lust and mischief, will not help men with love spells or malevolent sendings of disease by witchcraft, will not favor one man above his neighbor, or one tribe above its rivals, as reward for sacrifice which he does not accept, or as constrained by charms which do not touch his omnipotence. Ghosts and ghost gods, on the other hand, in need of food and blood, afraid of spells and binding charms, are a corrupt, but to man, a useful constituency. Man being what he is, man was certain to go a-whoring after practically useful ghosts, ghost gods, and fetishes, which he could keep in his wallet or medicine bag. For these he was sure, in the long run, first to neglect his idea of his creator, next perhaps to reckon to him as only one, if the highest, of the venal rabble of spirits or deities, and to sacrifice to him as to them, and this is exactly what happened. Thus, in theory the model does make sense. Primitive hunter-gatherers live pretty simplistic lives, getting by on the bare minimum for survival. Within such societies, cooperation is key and necessary. So the only god one would need to mainly focus on is the supreme creator, who governs life, death, and morality. So all the members act ethically and cooperate to ensure the tribe's survival. As cultures developed, they realized the supreme god could not be used for selfish desires, and chased after other spirits they thought existed, who could fulfill their greed or lust. And interestingly enough, this is what we see in the developed ancient societies. Gods were brought gifts and offerings in exchange for rewards. Ironically, polytheist Jordan Paper, who wrote a book on polytheistic theology, admits to this basic concept, that within polytheism, temples are built for deities in exchange for being helpful. Ancestors can be called upon for assistance, and then Paper admits more than he realizes. One has nothing to lose by making offerings to every available deity. Polytheistic deities, in contrast to the monotheistic one, seem not to be jealous of each other, and they do not punish for being slighted. Although one cannot expect benefits if one does ignore those important to one's life. If a particular deity does not help one, perhaps another will. In other words, not all the time, but often, people who turn to polytheism do so because it's useful and beneficial, which interestingly enough is what we see in the biblical account. The early patriarchs were monotheistic, but then as time went on, the culture degraded into polytheism. In Israel, after it settled down and was no longer nomadic, turned to other more useful gods they could exchange gifts with. Thus the biblical account fits with Lang's model and the data we already went over from studying hunter-gatherer societies. Early primitive cultures were monotheistic, and as they grew and desired more, they turned to other gods for help, which is what we see in the developed city-states of Mesopotamia. And this also fits with an idea Edward Sermon has argued for, that pastoral and nomadic cultures lean more towards monotheism. Multiple gods require a culture that is settled down in cities, so more attention can be paid to the gods. It is not pragmatic to attend to holy tents or the shrines of multiple gods when you have to keep moving around. Food for offerings is much harder to obtain in this setting when your main focus is just on finding enough to survive. It is settled people who rely on farming that have the ability to give attention to multiple gods. It is not impossible, but much harder for mobile people to mimic this. So this idea fits with Lang and Schmidt's model, that as people groups settled, they moved towards polytheism. In fact, in many of these cultures that developed into early civilizations, we can see how the model of evolution away from monotheism may have unfolded. For example, the Inca was a clear polytheistic society. However, from what we can piece together, within their culture, there seems to have been an out-of-place monotheistic cult, who directed worship towards the high creator god, Viracocha. Peter Connor notes standard Inca religion focused on a pantheon of gods, with the sun god Inti at its head. However, from oral traditions and limited textual data, a monotheistic cult sprang up just prior to the Spaniards' arrival that focused on worship of the creator deity. Viracocha was said to have created the world and then sailed away, leaving rulership to lesser gods. But there seems to have been a movement late in the empire that called for a return to the worship of Viracocha. Gordon Brotherston records that one of the Incan hymns refers to Viracocha as father and implies he was a good shepherd. He admits the parallels here with Semitic liturgy and the logic of, say, the Lord is my shepherd, are so strong that an influence via the Spanish Christian mission might be suspected were it not for numerous independent testimonies to the nature of the situa. Archaeologist John Hallen Rowe collected several of the hymns to Viracocha, which record that he created everything by speaking into existence, like let there be earth and heaven, let there be man and woman, let there be day and night. He notes these are all very similar to biblical statements about God, and borrowing was suspected. But he says, the suggestion has been made by readers of Molina's rather free Spanish translations that the concepts in these prayers, which parallel Christian ones, might be due to Spanish influence in the years following the conquest. Study of the Inca texts makes such an idea highly unlikely because the phraseology in the original is so different from that used in Christian Inca literature. The Spanish missionaries seem to have deliberately avoided the terms current in the native religion, and many of them were lost with the conversion of the Inca nobility to Catholicism. This is one reason why previous students of these texts have had so much trouble restoring them. We're not dealing here with a reflection of Spanish Christianity, but with another great religion. Thus, the evidence suggests there was monotheism, even present among the Inca. Similarly, Tarmo Kumar has argued from linguistics and historical data that there was a supreme god in the ancient Estonian religion called Teira or Toru, and who was later forgotten and replaced by lesser deities. In the ancient Near East, we can see how the degradation to polytheism could have happened if Lang's model is true. In Sumerian mythology, the sky god and creator of all the other gods was called An. Jeremy Black describes An as a supreme deity, very distant from the affairs of humans. In the ancient city of Uruk, the An district and temple are much older than the other parts of the city, like the Inanna district. Jean Botero says, "Thus An was the ancestor, the source and the guarantee of power. One could rely on his experience in times of crisis, but he left the effective exercise of sovereign authority to his son Enlil. Enki Ea stood next to the holder of power, the one who had only to order to see himself obeyed by the entire universe." This view of An being distant and only called upon in times of crisis is similar to how some primitive tribes viewed their high god. Botero notes at the top of the Sumerian pantheon was a triad of deities, An, Enlil, meaning Lord Wind or Lord Spirit, and Enki, which could mean Lord Below, Lord Earth, or given one of his functions and a connection to his Akkadian name, Lord of Life. Enki was lord of the subterranean aquifers, which were seen as life-giving. He is also credited with making mankind from earth or clay, or with the help of the earth goddess. In creation accounts that predate the Enuma Elish, these three are credited with creation. An, creator of heaven and earth, Enki, the creator of mankind, and Enlil, the active power or ruler in the world. T.J. Meek, building on other scholars, suggested An was the original god of the Proto-Sumerians, before their religion evolved into polytheism. The idea is that Enlil and Enki were originally manifestations or extensions of An, and then later were thought of as separate gods. However, we have to recognize this is speculative and unprovable. I'm not saying this is definitely what happened. At best we can say, if Lang's theory is true, we at least have a model of how the early Sumerian and Akkadian religions would fit. Finally, in Canaan, the high god was known as El, known as the Eternal One, the Father of the Gods, and Creator of the world. He was also identified with An and at times Enki. But consistent with Tyler's model, worship of this high god slowly faded over time, and his tasks were taken over by lesser and more useful gods. Karl Vandertorn says, "By the beginning of the Iron Age, the cult of El survived in some border zones of the Near East. In most regions, however, including Palestine, El's career as a living god, as a cultic reality and an object of actual devotion, had ended. El survived in one place, and known by another more complex name, which was amongst the Israelites, an anomaly of ancient Near Eastern cultures." Now we need to stop and draw back for a minute and note the limitations of this research. Some Christians have gotten a little too excited about this data and jumped to too many conclusions and relied on hearsay. The data alone cannot prove all tribes trace back to Adam and Eve, or that each high god of each culture is a derivation of Yahweh. I also have to disagree with one of Schmidt's conclusions. Schmidt implied this was evidence of divine revelation in the distant past, but that seems to be overstepping. The belief alone among primitive people in a supreme creator and a moral authority can be explained in purely naturalistic terms, as Lang posited. As humans evolved, they slowly grew to understand the basics of natural theology and philosophical ideas, just like humans evolved to understand science, ethics, and mathematics. Early humans were not incapable of understanding, and could have easily converged to comprehend the basic ideas of natural theology and the inference to a creator. As Lang posited, once they learned how to make things, the inference to a first maker can be drawn. Plus, if God did reveal himself to mankind, as I've argued for, humans would naturally have to reach a point in their intellect where they could understand such things. It makes no sense to try to teach math to an animal who doesn't have the mental capacity to understand mathematics. And likewise, early humans would have to already understand the existence of the divine through basic philosophy before the divine could reveal himself to mankind. So although I do think revelation did happen in the past, I don't think we can infer this happened with every primitive group who believed in a high moral authority or a creator. Also, I want to acknowledge I'm aware that Schmidt relied on the cultural historical method, a view of history that most historians have moved on from. Although the general framework is still viable, Schmidt believed cultures move from neat circles and progress to higher levels, an idea that doesn't always work in reality, as cultural changes can be more random and less like moving in a linear fashion with distinct features. Because of Schmidt's critics, we cannot definitively say monotheism is the oldest religion, as some tribes that were defined by Schmidt as primitive did not show signs of monotheism. Nor can we know for sure if there was not a prior stage of evolution before belief in the high god. I think Mircea Eliade is probably correct when he says, "It is true that the belief in high gods seems to characterize the oldest cultures, but we also find there other religious elements. As far as we can reconstruct the most remote past, it is safer to assume that religious life was from the very beginning rather complex, and that elevated ideas coexisted with lower forms of worship and belief." But even with these limitations understood, we cannot pretend there are no implications as well. Many scholars presuppose monotheism was a late idea and could not possibly have existed as far back as the Middle Bronze Age, let alone the Neolithic. But this data directly challenges that idea and shows it is plausible. Monotheism is a very ancient idea that existed throughout the ages alongside polytheism. So the idea that biblical authors just fabricated that their ancient patriarchs throughout Genesis were monotheists is possible, but it is also plausible they actually did retain through oral traditions a memory that they descended from monotheists, who focused on worshiping the supreme god. But also, I'm sure you're aware that throughout this video, I kept highlighting aspects of various tribes that had similarities in their beliefs to what we find in Genesis. Now I admit this was intentional. All these tribes may have had various similarities to Genesis, but they also contain several differences that do not align with Genesis. But that is besides the point I'm making, because a common claim I hear is that the customs and claims of Genesis must match a late period, as they do not correlate with older Mesopotamian mythology. For example, in Genesis, God creates or orders by speaking, which is not present in older Mesopotamian creation accounts that focus on a cosmic battle between beings that are not in complete control. So Genesis is assumed to be advanced theology and represent a later time period as religions evolve towards monotheism. But the evidence indicates very similar ideas can exist in primitive hunter-gatherer societies. So the idea that customs and beliefs present in Genesis had to develop late is not the only possibility. Given that many things that are present in Genesis exist in various primitive cultures, its claims could correlate with a primitive time period, and may be reliable oral traditions that go back to early stages, and not just be late ideas, as it is often presupposed. Also, if Lang's model is true, then one could infer that the monotheistic account of origins within Mesopotamian literature is more reliable than the polytheistic versions, which would represent a more degraded and developed tradition, away from what the original stories were. Ultimately though, the idea of monotheism was a late development seems untenable, and the idea monotheistic accounts of the past are unreliable and anachronistic cannot be presupposed in light of this data. There are indications monotheism flourished in ancient hunter-gatherer societies, and lived alongside polytheistic cultures throughout the ages, and thus, there is no reason to presuppose the biblical account is anachronistic and late.